like that. So that way, if somebody has a question, I can see it. Also, I have my chat open too. So, all right, just to start off with, I don't know if I just need to start, right? I mean, you guys all know who I am, so.
Yeah, I
So,
was gonna introduce you, but then I'm like, oh wait, this is everybody knows you. So
yeah, everybody knows me. At least I hope. And if you don't, well, then surprise, here I am. I put in the chat a link to the Charlie Foundation, and I'll talk about it as we go through, but it's got some really good information for keto diet, reasons behind it, variations of it, and things that's more focused on like the neuroprotective effects, especially tied to neuroinflammation or other like brain issues, rather than a lot of the other ones out and about that you'll find that are more tied to like weight loss or, kind of like that more bro culture kind of thing, which, I mean, those ones have some good stuff too, but you have to kind of wade through it a bit. And the Charlie Foundation just has a different focus. And a lot of it is a focus for parents with children with epilepsy in order to help create diet ideas for their children that their children will eat in order to help with the seizures and things. But we'll get into that. So, all right, so I'll be talking about keto diet for ME/CFS and long COVID and basics of what it is, and also kind of like things to watch out for, and then also like how to measure stuff like that. I'm not going to spend too long on it because I want to make sure we have time for questions if anybody has them. So anyway, so what is keto? So you hear keto, it's a popular fad diet in like the last 10 years and all. It was actually originally developed in the 1920s. So it's based on this theory that going back clear to Hippocrates in ancient Greece, that this idea, or that it was observed that people with epilepsy had fewer seizures. I don't know if you can hear my dogs in the background. I think somebody just drove by or something. They're making much noise, but they're upstairs, so don't know if it comes through. But anyway, in ancient Greece, it was observed, or they recorded at the time, that they found that people who had epilepsy or had seizures, that when they were fasting, they had fewer seizures, but fewer to none. But that's obviously unsustainable. You cannot fast forever. So what's going on there and all? And this is the fasting aspect is actually a really common part of sickness behavior. Like you'll notice it in animals. Like, how do you know your cat's really sick? We stops eating. And it's kind of like this natural thing our body does in order to kind of do a lot of heal and repair, access our own fat stores in order to be able to avoid some of the stresses that eating gives our system, especially when you're dealing with some sort of pathogen or infection or something like that. So that way you can keep from bringing in something extra to have to deal with it. So you go into a fasted state and you end up generating ketone bodies or ketones. So in the 1920s, doctors were trying to figure out how to mimic that fasted state without actually starving, because you can't stay in it forever. So they found that if you have a diet where the vast majority of your calories come in from fat and very few from carbs, it'll generate ketones that are used for energy that's similar to in the fasted state where you're pulling from your own fat stores. Now, even in keto or ketogenesis, you can still be pulling from your own fat stores. That's kind of like an ideal to keep you stable. But you can also just be generating ketones only from the foods you consume. But I'll get into that in just a bit. So. Now, the keto or ketogenesis diet, it fell out of use once anticonvulsants were developed until the 1900s when Jim Abrahams, executive producer for like films and things, was looking for a way to help his son who had severe epilepsy that wasn't able to be controlled by medication. So that's also kind of like there's I think Meryl Streep was in a movie that was referencing or that was about this. It's called like First Do No Harm. And then there was another, the idea of like Lorenzo's oil is based on this concept too. So he went and found that this previous diet that was developed in the 1920s was actually fairly successful. And so he was working on, so they developed that for his son, and he had a lot of success, and he really wanted to help other people who were dealing with epilepsy specifically, but it also helps a lot of other disorders that have like a neuroinflammatory effect. And so he created the Charlie Foundation for Ketogenic Therapies to help people access the diet and the science behind it. And it wasn't until like in the last like 15 years or so that keto really hit the mainstream. I mean, it did kind of with the Atkins diets. That was actually a big part of what was actually the effect of it was some aspects of ketogenesis. But it wasn't in which that started originally in the 1970s, but really it was like what the late 90s, early aughts that that kind of caught on, and then keto came after that. And it can be a really effective diet for some people, but it's not for everybody. And I'll get into some of the disclaimers and the reasons why it may work for you and a way it may not, and all that kind of thing. But so this is after this, after I'm done with the presentation, I'll also share the PowerPoint on Slack so that way you guys can have access to this. And I have like these links embedded, but this is the same link that's in the chat right now. So anyway, so my history with keto. So I had my first keto infection or keto COVID infection in March 2nd, 2020. So I'm getting close to my 4th anniversary of it. I didn't really I had 3 weeks of pretty severe acute and, you know, got better. And then about 3 months after my infection first started, I got hit with the long COVID aspect. And it kept progressing. So I went from being reasonably functional, things like that, thinking I was going to take up running and stuff to, you know, because I'm not going to get sick like that again. I'm going to get myself in shape so that way I don't have those lung issues again. Yeah, that's, I didn't know any better at the time. We know better now, right? And then, so by that fall, I was really wondering, how do people with long COVID or ME/CFS, how do you deal with wheelchairs? Because I didn't have the energy to, you know, propel myself in one. So how would I be able to, you know, use one? I mean, I was really getting, because I could walk, but like 20 steps and that was it. So I was trying to figure out various things, trying out different stuff, staying on some of the long COVID groups on Facebook. Especially in that first year, they were really helpful. I'm not saying that they're not helpful now. It's just it's a bit different now, and yeah, I'm not going to get into the whole drama of that. But anyway, several people in that Facebook group had said they tried keto with a lot of success and started sharing information about how, you know, its origination and that it was really helpful for neuroinflammation and helped you generate more energy. And so I thought, what the heck? I might as well try it. It doesn't seem to have any downsides. It's not that it doesn't, I just didn't know about them. I'll talk about that in a bit. But so I figured, well, I'll try it for 2 weeks, see if it works. And if not, well, then, you know, it was something. So reason why I did 2 weeks was because there's often a transition period where people take some time for their body to adapt from generating energy from glucose to ketones. Sometimes it's called the keto flu sometimes. But by the end of that first week, I was actually feeling, I was easily in full ketosis and I had so much energy. I really felt like my old self. I mean, I was kind of bouncing off the walls because I hadn't had this kind of energy in such a long time. By the way, this is how I met Tess. She asked if I wanted to be a keto buddy on Twitter. And that's how we first got connected. Because I've mentioned how I was doing keto and she was too. So, also, this level of food restriction, it came with that original first 2 weeks because that's one of the things that I did. I cut out a lot of things and was trying to find ways to add extra fat in and to try to balance it out. It also helped a lot with my MCAS because this eliminated a lot of foods I didn't realize were such a problem for me. And as I was gradually trying to add things in to the keto diet so that I would see if I could have a little bit of it, I could easily see then when something was a reactive one for me. So it helped a lot for that. Just accidentally. So no, this worked really well for me. I was doing great. My ketones were almost always fairly high on my measuring tests and all. I was usually like right around 2.0 and higher, things like that on the ketone my blood testing. This worked really great for me until I had my second suspected COVID infection in December of 2022. It kept testing negative, but you know how the tests are. And I started struggling to generate ketones even when I went into really strict with the fat content of my food on that. I also tried aspects of fasting for extended periods, like for 48 hours or so, and I could just get like over 1.5, and then as soon as I would eat anything, I would dip back down. And so I was trying to figure out what's going on. Why is this happening? Because it was working so well for me, and then it suddenly stopped. So and I'll get into why that might be the case. No, it wasn't that I wasn't generating any ketones, and I still had some of the cognitive benefit from it, but it just the actual physical energy, and I was starting to put on weight again, so that there was just some issue from it. So I was trying to figure it out. So anyway, basics about keto. So ketones or ketone bodies, we just usually say short ketones, and because there's several different ones, I'm not going to go into all of them because you start getting into the science names of them, and it's really, I mean, it's good to know, but you know, there's lots of ways to look it up. I can always give you more of those if you want. But in general, ketones produce more ATP than glucose with less reactive oxygen species, which is great for us, right? That's what we're trying to limit. This is especially true in cases of hypoxia, and it helps lower the neural inflammation if you have some sort of brain hypoxia. So especially when you get reoxygenated in that. So that's, again, with a lot of us wondering about like when we're like hypoperfusion or possible hypoxia issues, that's this is a big deal for us. This is from one article that I found that, by the way, Kat, this article, you'll love it because it also talks about glutamate and how ketones actually help glutamate. I shared that with Tess. I was like, I read this and I know that this is going to be Kat. She's going to love this part. But the idea that they provide a neuroprotective role through, again, metabolic efficiency, sparing glucose, and then also they depress the glucose uptake, and then also, just to help block some of that resulting oxidative damage. So again, we also talk about pyruvate all the time, things like that, the lactate pyruvate ratio and all that. So there's just so much that's important with ketones when it comes to that, again, neuroprotective effect, especially when we talk about oxidative stress, which, while that's just another little fun thing out there, that pretty much all of the cells of your body need insulin to be able to use glucose. It shepherds it into the cell, except for your brain. Your brain can use glucose directly, which is one reason why if you have a blood sugar drop, it'll affect your brain very quickly. It's because your cells suddenly, your body cells ended up being able to use the glucose, and then that didn't leave anything left for your brain. And if you don't have ketones available, you'll find a very cognitive drop right at that time, and there's some extreme things where you can like go unconscious and things, but we're not going to get into all that right here. So this last quote on here is from the Charlie Foundation. But the idea of achieving ketosis has a lot of benefits to optimize performance. And then it's the optimizing performance that really caught on with a lot of those, like the keto bros and that kind of things. They're trying to like optimum cognitive function, optimum physical function, all of that. While we would love optimum function, we would like to have like increased function. We'd be thrilled with a little bit of an increase, right? But it is fairly well documented that there is benefits. The actual mechanisms for all the benefits are not extremely well known. This has been an area that probably should have been researched a lot more over the last century. It just was, it wasn't really addressed as much, especially when we started having those research studies that came out saying fat is bad. And then anything that was trying to say, well, fat could be good in some extent was really hard to get that research funded and studied and things, so, and published. So that's a whole other thing. Yeah, not going to get into all of that one. But then, so fat was removed from a lot of our foods, especially in the 1980s. And if you guys remember Snackwell cookies or anything like that, and they just basically switched out the fat for more sugar to make them palatable, which didn't necessarily help what they were trying to target, and didn't lower the rates or incidence of heart disease, which is one of the concerns with the high-fat diet, that it could raise the incidence of heart disease. But on the other hand, there's also more ties in with like sugar and foods with the higher carbohydrate foods, and that there's actually several cultures that people have been for several millennia have been surviving on basically like a high-fat and protein diet. Think like the Inuit, things like the Sami people. There's a lot of different ones that do survive. They do handle that quite a bit. So, and they didn't necessarily have high rates of heart disease at the time, but until more like carbohydrates were introduced. So it does optimize a lot of things for us, but it's not perfect, and it doesn't fix everything, and there are some issues, and it's not like it has zero health negative effects. But we're going to, but everything does too. So we're just trying to talk about the basics of it. So I'd spend too much time getting into it and getting into all my other little theories, but that'd get us going. So let's say you wanted to start the keto diet. How do you start? Well, there's different types of keto diets out there. Some are more extreme and some are more maintenance after first achieving that original state of ketosis. The goal is to have the vast majority of your calories come from fat, especially if you can, medium chain triglycerides, MCT, if you can. Long chain triglycerides are the most commonly used, though, because they're the easiest just to add to your diet. I mean, it's just that they're just out there. That's kind of like easy to get. But planning out what you will eat for your trial period before you start actually helps quite a bit to avoid yeah, it's the calorie ratio, not grams. Yeah, because the amount of calories per gram is very, very different. So planning out what you will eat for your trial period when you're testing it out helps quite a bit to start. So that way you're not getting into as much dirty keto, which I'll talk about in just a bit. It's not that that's necessarily bad, and yeah, I'm probably would probably say that I have a tendency towards dirty keto, but that's just because I'm not very good at counting and calculating every little calorie and things. I'm like, yeah, this is approximate, and then I go from there. It's only when I'm trying to be more rigid about it that I'll be watching it more closely. The Charlie Foundation has a lot more guides on how to start the keto diets and the different types of them and what they do. So classic keto has a fat ratio of 4:1 from fat to protein and carbs. So that's 90% fat, 6% protein, and only 4% carbs as far as your total calories. That's a lot of fats. That's one of the things people who think they're going to start a keto diet and they're like, yeah, I love eating fatty foods. And it was like, no, you don't realize how much fat you actually have to eat to get started in this, to get into some of these restrictive ones. Modified keto is closer to 3:1, so 82% fat, 12% protein, 6% carbs. I've seen a lot of suggestions out there when they talk about like in the more the bro keto kind of ones out there, they aim for like 65 to 70% fat, and then protein, and then carbs after that. You always want to have more protein than carbs. Carbs would usually overall be very limited. But it's going to be, again, functioning on what works best for you, helps you maintain ketogenesis. So that's just going to be some of the different portions of it, just what works. There's also just overall low carb or low glycemic index style diets. It's a lot less structured. It doesn't necessarily promote keto or ketogenesis or any staying in ketosis, but it does help a lot of those who are not processing glucose efficiently, but also can't really do the restrictions of keto. So it's kind of trying to give you both of those. And it's more concerned with, say, like higher fiber and complex and various things like that. So it's not bad. It just helps keep you from away some of those blood sugar spikes that might be problematic for you. And some people have actually been able, I know a couple of people that they were able to achieve like ketosis, and then they could just go with low carb after that, and then they do very well. Now, when it comes to initiating ketogenesis, fasting is often a great way to kick it off, but that doesn't work for everybody. Intermittent fasting is a way to also get some of the benefits of it without necessarily any of the food restrictions. So like limiting like alternate days, or limiting like your eating window to being a small portion of the day, things like that. So that can get you some of the benefits of it too, without necessarily triggering the whole whole aspect of trying to the restricted diet part of it. But also, if you are using MCT, so like MCT oil, or you're able to add a lot of coconut oil into your diet, you can actually be a lot less restrictive, because your liver will go for that first, and even before glucose, in order to generate energy. So it'll actually start having you generate ketones right away from that. It really likes that. I can't have coconut. So, anyway. So, but some warnings before we get going on this, especially talking about restrictive, if you have any tendency towards an eating disorder, this may not be a good diet for you to start. The reasons for that is needing to eat a specific amount of fat in order to stay in ketosis with the risk of being knocked out if you consume too many carbs or even too much protein can activate that perfection issue that's very common in eating disorders. So that you'll feel like you're failed or guilty and you've got to make sure you're rigidly adhering to it. That can be really problematic. So the tracking of the grams of fat, protein, carbs, all of this, the calorie counting, all of this can easily become obsessive. So it can trigger an eating disorder in some people. So that's also something to watch out for. So if you have a history of an eating disorder, or you have people in your family that are, if you have history of OCD, things like that, this is going to be something in which you want to be very, very careful with, because it's very easy to slide into that with it. Again, because you have to be in ketosis for it to work. So that ends up making it that feeling of perfection. So that can be, again, really a problem. But overall, this diet should be helping you feel better, not worse. If the stress of the tracking, the counting, feeling guilty and not achieving the perfection, the ketosis, if all of that feels overwhelming to you, it's perfectly fine not to do it. We're not saying you have to do it. Even if this would benefit you, that doesn't mean you have to do it. If it's causing you this other stress, that's actually detrimental, right? Even people who do the keto diet and benefit from it and do it long term, they don't always consistently track or stay in ketosis. Often they go in and out a little bit, sometimes, cracking down again, but then, wavering and not. Back when I was first doing it and was working really well, I would have pasta one night a week, every 2 weeks, so that way I could just have something that I enjoyed. Not saying I didn't enjoy the food otherwise, but it was just something that I could have elsewhere. So it just, depending again how your body reacts to it and that, about how rigid you need to adhere and that, but also, again, it shouldn't be about perfection. So if it works for you sometimes, but not other times, that's fine. And if you just don't feel like doing it because of that risk, that's entirely fine too. It's not a magic cure for energy issues. It's just one of the many possible tools we have to kind of eke out that little bit more energy than what we had before. Some people have a massive energy bump with this, and other people, it's a bit of improvement, maybe a little bit of clarity of brain fog, but it's not necessary. It's not a magic cure, and you still have to pace, and you still have to do all of that, and track everything else that we have to do, because that's just our risk. So yeah, I've got my cat here. He likes to sit right where my mouse is. He's not like my other one. She likes to put her paws on my hand when I'm using my mouse, like it's a Ouija board control thing. So what can you eat on the keto diet? Kat, you're saying mare's milk is high in MCTs. That does not surprise me. That actually, because of the way it's developed and all, yeah. That's one reason why what I can't remember what the alcohol is you can make out of it, is probably right in that too. So anyway,
or arag, yes.
Arag, there we
and
go.
I'm
Yeah,
absolutely going to be looking into that. It was also a tuberculosis cure. Very
which makes sense, because the hypoxia with tuberculosis, but also one of the things that can kick you into ketogenesis. This is definitely not something I would recommend to do it, but this is something you may notice in animals that have been deprived of water and that are very dehydrated. They lose weight very quickly. That's because it kicks them into ketogenesis. That's why, part of the reason why. So don't do dehydration in order to do keto. That's not a safe way to do it, but that's something that you might see in animals. So put him in his little box, see if he'll sleep there. So what can you eat? Well, it really depends on what other food restrictions you have. Thanks, MCAS, right? Like I can't use any of the MCT oils or any of those ones, or a lot of the pre-made keto foods, because coconut is one of the common ingredients because it's so helpful for ketogenesis. But it is one that is a definite no-go for me. So there are a wide variety of pre-made products out there due to the popularity of this diet in recent years. A lot of them are gluten or dairy-free, depending on them. But again, you're going to want to watch the labels, especially if you have any of your reactive ingredients. It's mixed on some of the different products about how good they are about labeling everything. Some of them are really good, some of them aren't. That's where, honestly, keto is best if you can, make it yourself, or otherwise generate it yourself, or have somebody doing it for you. So that way you know all the ingredients in it, just for us, because MCAS is such an issue. If you can, fresh foods are best. Again, MCAS, right there with that too. Especially since, given the restrictions of it, it's sometimes hard to get enough plant material in us. There are some ways to do, say, like vegan, even some aspects of vegetarian on keto. It's a lot harder, but there are resources out there for that. So while fresh foods are best, it's not always, again, not perfect for what necessarily what you are, and again, limiting on what we can actually eat. So while you do need to avoid starchy vegetables, non-starchy ones are a great addition to your diet for this. Berries in moderation are often suggested on most keto diets, things like raspberries, strawberries, blueberries, things like that. But again, moderation. And also they got a lot of the different nutrients that you need otherwise. Celery, broccoli, spinach, lettuce, squash, cabbage, jicama. A lot of these are often recommended. And then basically anything not starchy, and even some of the starchy ones, even potatoes in very restricted quantities, you could still do, especially if anything starchy, if it's cooked and then chilled, you get it's more resistant starch, and so more higher fiber content. Because that's kind of what you're trying to go for, is this net carbs. And so that's the total carbs minus the fiber. Depending, again, how your body's processing it. And when you start getting into some of those and start really watching the labels on that, you realize that nutrition science is not precise. And so you realize how much all over the place they are about, like, how much fiber actually counts, or calories, or what they count as a fiber, and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of lists out there for suggestions for keto-friendly vegetables. And again, like, a lot of vegetables would be fine, but in much lower quantities than you would typically consume. So it's going to be what works best for you on that. And again, you might end up just being on the low carb end and not necessarily into keto, fully into ketogenesis. So, dirty keto, that's using a lot of, say, like processed foods and that, without watching the quantity of what you are consuming, and just trying to, like, eyeball your ratios a bit. It's a lot easier, and it's not as stress inducing sometimes as some of the rest of keto, but I'm really watching your grams of fat and total calories and all this. It's easier, but it's not necessarily as healthy, again, because you're likely not really getting in a lot of those fresher foods. You do, again, want to, if you can, because of the you don't want to get malnourished when you're in this, so you want to make sure you have as much of your vegetable count as possible. Again, but that's just kind of like a I feel like that's probably the hardest part in keto, once besides staying in ketogenesis, is actually making sure that you're staying well nourished. So yeah. Anyway, so what can you do for tracking? Well, you can use various ketone like a ketone meter, and blood prick one. That's what mine is here. So this, you just have the little strip, very similar to a glucometer. So it's a finger prick. It gives a pretty good reading of current blood or capillary levels of ketones. But I was mentioning at the very beginning here, it's not necessarily measuring what the different cells in your body are generating for ketones, which your brain can actually generate ketones itself. So you're not measuring that. You're just measuring what the rest of your body's doing. So even if your blood levels of ketones are low, that doesn't mean you're not getting a benefit from it, or that your brain itself isn't in ketosis. It's just your total body may not be generating as much. The urine test strips, you can get these usually like or one of the downsides of the blood meter is, there's a bit of an investment cost to buy the meter, but it's not too expensive. The expense is the ketone strips. They can be, depending on how large of a quantity, they're almost like $1 each. You buy a large. There we go. So the blood tests can be, the little blood meter, again, it's not too expensive to start off, but the strips themselves can get prohibitive over time. So especially if you're really tracking like multiple times a day, it adds up very, very quickly. The urine test strips are cheaper. They're still not extremely cheap, but they are also something you can get. And it's just when you just dip it in your urine, and again, it's got the little little meter thing. I don't know if you guys can see that. There we go. I'll try if I can get closer. There we go. So it's got the little scale there about how well or where you're at in it, about how, and these ones you can get from usually pharmacies carry these no problem because they're accessible for diabetics, especially type 1 diabetics, to check for the risk of ketoacidosis, which I'll talk about in a second. So they have to watch for that, so they keep those strips handy. So they're not as expensive as a ketone meter, but again, they're not cheap. But they're, again, depending on how often you use them. So you can also use a glucometer, like your typical one that you would use for like tracking for blood sugar for like diabetes or overall just blood sugar tracking. Those are not too expensive, depending on what you get. If you have a prescription for it, then that can be a lot cheaper. They can also get you in the US, you have to have a prescription for a continuous glucose monitor. And so it's one where you'd have it on your arm. You may notice a difference if you do that between a glucometer like this versus the continuous, because it's measuring capillary versus the interstitial fluid, but that's a whole other thing. You can still get them with again, available purchase, but even without a prescription. But with a prescription, it might be cheaper. Again, cheaper than a ketone meter, but to use them constantly, you can still run up a cost on that. But the strips are a lot cheaper than the ketone test strips. So then there's also the breath meters. Tess has one of those. So it's great for people who can't do the finger prick test. It's pretty accurate on your test of your current ketone levels. But it has a higher original cost for it, but you don't have to keep doing the like test strips and things like that. So it's costs more to start, but it also, long term, it's probably a savings. So it's kind of like which way you want to do it. You don't necessarily have to measure your ketones in that, but it does help quite a bit to help you know where you're at and if it's working or not for you. So. And then some problems that could arise. Ketoacidosis, that's the big one to, at least to start off with, that could be a danger. It can be life-threatening. This is something that's more common in type 1 diabetics. This is when your blood glucose and ketones are both high. So that you're not either not having enough insulin, or the insulin is not being working to pull things into your cells, and then the ketoacidosis is very damaging. And that's when if you get like the urine test strips, they'll actually have like up here about like this is the danger level, and that would be starting to get into like a higher risk of like kidney damage and other like life-threatening damage. So that is something to watch out for. It's really uncommon in people who aren't diabetic, especially type 1 diabetic. Type 2 diabetes actually has a slightly lower risk of it, but it still can happen. It's just still something to watch out for. That's one reason why I think like a glucometer is a good idea, just so that way you can be watching your glucose at the same time as your ketones. So if they're going up together, then that's a concerning event about like what's going on in there. You might have something else going on you didn't realize. So now keto flu, not near as much of a dramatic thing as ketoacidosis. But this is in that transition process from your body generating energy from glucose to using ketones. There's this period of lower energy and just generally not feeling great. And people end up with some brain fog. Just generally, they can feel crappy, cranky, various things like that. It's usually short term. I've heard some different ones about it. It's typical be like usually about 2 weeks. It's heard some extremes that it could take 4 weeks for some people. But I feel like if somebody's taking 4 weeks to get into ketogenesis, they're probably not going to keep doing it because they just feel like crap. So why would they keep doing it? Right? I mean, that's kind of the thing with it. So it should be fairly short term. So using keto supplements like BHB or other like ketone esters or various things like that can actually help ease that transition. If you can have coconut, MCT oil can also help with that transition. Just being able to get your body used to using ketones instead. So as just an anecdote, a lot of ME CFS patients report that keto flu didn't happen with them. because they're probably already using ketones, especially in the brain, even if it was not in their blood level. But that's probably because glucose just not being glucose use is not really very efficient, and that's in our illness. That's just kind of one of those things that we're trying to figure out why, right? And so that might be one reason why they'll find that they're in ketogenesis already. So again, that's just anecdotal. So I mean, there may be actual research out there on it, but I haven't grabbed that or looked for that specifically. But I just a lot of people I've talked to, they said they never felt the keto flu on that. So also another problem with keto is it does require a lot more energy to prep ahead of time to make sure you're getting those whole foods to calculate that your fat content is as the amount that you need. If you have somebody else who can help you, that is going to be overall a big help in trying to get this to work for you. But it's not a not necessarily required, and it also depends on how and what kind of like easy foods that you can get to. So that's going to be what works for you. Also, another anecdotal thing, a lot of people with ME/CFS have reported that when they're in a crash, glucose is absolutely necessary in order to navigate the crash and process through it. And the ketones and trying to stay in ketogenesis is not helpful at that point. When they're not in a crash, they find that keto can work really well for them, or low carb in general. But in a crash, they need glucose, and so they'll go to more carbohydrate-based foods in that time. Again, anecdotal, but just kind of keep that in mind too about like what's working for you and what's not. If that's one reason why the idea of like trying to be rigid adhering to this is not necessarily going to be best for everybody, because it's going to be like what works for you and adjust as necessary. So now it might not work for you because some people struggle to generate enough ketones for an energy bump. Some of the possible reasons. Histamine is needed to kickstart ketogenesis in the liver, so to make it work. So if you've got your MCAS just a little too well controlled with H1 blockers, you may not have enough histamine left in order to generate the ketones. That's just a possibility on it. Or if you have like some other liver stress in that. When I stopped being able to generate ketones well after that second COVID infection, also my ALT went up. So that was kind of like I think it was my ALT. So we were just trying to figure out what was going on with that. And so I backed off on a lot of my antihistamines, my H1 blockers. And, it helped some, but I still wasn't generating a whole lot of ketones. But then I found this study that after COVID, it commonly causes this impaired ketogenesis. So this is actually part of the T cell dysfunction after COVID. It's because the CD4 positive cells are being starved a bit because they need ketones a lot for their energy, and they're not doing as well with glucose and when you're in the illness state. And with COVID, they found that it's actually impairing your liver's ability to generate the ketones. Supplementing with like BHB and other ketone esters can help with this effect. So that's also really helpful. Another thing that you might have an issue with is if you have higher levels of insulin for whatever reason. That gets into my whole GIP thing, but I'm not going to get into that today because otherwise I'd spend too much time with it. But if you have too high a level of insulin, it can interfere and prevent lipolysis, so accessing your own fat stores. So you might be able to generate ketones from consumed fat, but anything extra will be put right into storage, and you might start putting on weight if you're not really watching your calorie counts in that. So you might be able to generate ketones, but you may not, but only from the food that you eat and not actually accessing your own storage, which isn't ideal because you want to be able to access your own storage so you will maintain a consistent level of energy and not these peaks and crashes, which is one reason why you might be choosing keto versus just standard carb-based diet. So also, if you consume too high levels of protein, protein can be converted into glucose, so so that's going to be something that can interfere, knock you out of ketogenesis if your protein levels or protein intake is too high, or if you need higher protein, because some of us need a lot higher protein than what typical does too. So again, those might be ones why it's not working for you, or if it was working for you in the past and it's not working now, it could easily be part of that, the difficulty of the liver generating ketones. I haven't seen if that makes it all better or not, if it comes, if you can get over that or not. I'm still in an issue where I'm struggling sometimes to develop ketones at different levels, but especially if I've had a little bit of a flare, had some PEM, even when I'm out of that a little bit, I still struggle to generate the ketones again. And then when I can generate ketones again, I often have lower neuroinflammation and everything too. So I feel so it's like a win-win at that point. But that'll be a later talk what I think is going on with that. So all right, so that's the end of my presentation. Any questions? I mean, I didn't look at the chat but too much, so I don't know if somebody was watching those.
Can you